About 18,000 Chinese migrated to the British West Indies in the 19th century. Three-quarters of them, about 13,500, migrated to British Guiana. Over the course of the 19th century, 9 boatloads of Chinese migrants went to Trinidad. Only 4 boatloads arrived in Jamaica during this period. Who were these initial migrants? Why did they make the journey? And what were their lives like once they arrived? Such questions are not entirely new. As early as 1915, the Colonial Secretary of Guyana, Sir Cecil Clementi, sought to answer some of these very questions in The Chinese in British Guiana. In 1806, just under 200 Chinese men were brought to Trinidad to work on the sugar estates, the first Chinese indentured migrants to enter the British West Indies. Planters needed laborers who, unlike the ex-slaves, would diligently work at whatever task was assigned to them and quietly accept whatever wages the planters were willing to pay. Indenture, with its legally established fixed working period and wages, limitations on the laborer's mobility, and stringent penalties for absenteeism, seemed the ideal solution to the labor problem. With the exception of the 1806 migrants, Chinese indentured labor migration to the West Indies ran from 1853 to 1884, with the bulk of the migration over by 1866. Even then, there was not a steady stream of migrants. Instead, Chinese migration occurred largely in 2 waves, 1853 to 1854 and 1859 to 1866. This migration was sparked by the desperation caused by a series of natural disasters, floods and famine, that was compounded by significant political and civil unrest. Unsurprisingly, the city of Guangzhou supplied many migrants, but Xiamen and Shantou were considered just as valuable as locations for recruitment. The typical contract that laborers signed committed them to work 7.5 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 5 years, with a 5-day holiday at the Chinese New Year. Allotments, that is, monies out of their wages that was sent to family members in China on their behalf, were also initially provided for, although the planters would eventually get rid of that obligation. The migrants were not expected to pay for their journey to the colony, but no contractual provision was made for a return passage. The lack of a return passage would cause serious issues that would eventually contribute to the end of Chinese indentured migration. Without returnees to show off wealth they had made in the colony, British Guiana had little appeal as a labor destination. Clementi notes that in 1865, the Governor-General in Canton complained that no one had ever seen a migrant to the British West Indies return. Clementi's research indicated that the earliest returnees was a group of 14 Chinese in 1870, followed by a family of 15 in 1871. The migrants to British Guiana were not a cohesive group. They included individuals with various economic, social, and ethnic backgrounds. Clementi specifically mentions the Hoklo, Hakka, and Punti ethnic groups, for example. Also unique to the Chinese indenture experience in British Guiana was the fact that amongst the migrants was a relatively large component of Chinese Christians. The cornerstone of St. Saviour's, the Chinese Anglican Church in Georgetown, was laid in 1874. It has been suggested this might be the oldest congregation of Chinese Christians in the West. The Chinese community was large enough at one time to even establish its own village, Hopetown, in the 1860s. The presence of Chinese Christians speaks to the colonial office's willingness to use missionaries based in China to promote indentured labor. Despite a plethora of ordinances and official statements, there was a somewhat haphazard and opportunistic quality to the early phase of migration. The migrants were treated as chattel.
晚风吹送天河的星啊，归如绽放闪银辉。
The first hint that British Guiana should look to China for a supply of free labor is to be found in the report dated 12th June 1811 of a committee of the House of Commons, appointed to consider of the practicability and expediency of supplying our West Indian colonies with free laborers from the East. This committee reported, number 1, that there prevails amongst the male population of China a great disposition to emigrate, but that they almost universally emigrate with the intention of returning to their own country, and that a considerable number do actually return. Number 2, that the Chinese emigrants have uniformly conducted themselves with the greatest propriety and order, and have been peculiarly instrumental in promoting the improvement of those countries to which they have emigrated. Number 3, that such emigration, however, is contrary to the laws of China, although its existence to a great extent seems to imply that those laws are not strictly enforced. Nothing of substance happened for another 30 years. In May 1843, a Guyana proprietor who had been visiting most of the British possessions in the East, particularly Singapore, Malacca, and Penang, wrote to the West India Committee that he had been much impressed by the Chinese immigrants, of whom he found some 100,000 employed there as laborers. At Prince of Wales, Isle Penang, he said there are 2,000 acres of land cultivated exclusively by them, and during the heat of the day, I have seen them cutting canes, digging canals, carrying canes, etc., and I can state without hesitation, going through all the work as well as the best picked men Creoles would do. The climate is much the same as in British Guiana. The men are strong and powerful, and from infancy accustomed to toil, industrious, and eager to acquire money. I have seen all classes of coolies and the different tribes of Asia, but nowhere have I seen a people who would suit us and our purposes better. He added that Messrs. Barclay Brothers and Company and Messrs. Gignet and Company had obtained Chinese, natives of Amoy, for their Mauritius properties from Messrs. Brown and Company of Penang and Messrs. Spottiswoode and Connolly of Singapore. That about 1,000 Chinese had embarked from Mauritius, and that in his opinion, Chinese might be landed in British Guiana at from 10 to 12 pounds per head. Lord Stanley, then Secretary of State for the Colonies, indicated on the 4th of September 1843 that he would grant permission to introduce Chinese laborers into the West India colonies. Their intelligence, he wrote, their willingness to work for wages, and their frugal and industrious habits, as well as their capability of supporting the labor of sugar cultivation, combine to point them out as a valuable class of immigrants. The Court of Policy considered and passed on the 31st of January 1844 a bill entitled An Ordinance to Promote the Introduction of Chinese Laborers into British Guiana. The royal confirmation of this ordinance was conveyed to Governor Sir Henry Light by Lord Stanley in a dispatch dated 27th of March 1844. But the anticipations concerning Chinese immigration were not realized for another decade. However, as the result of the ordinances number 12 and number 13 of 1844, there arrived during 1845 in Demerara 563 immigrants from Calcutta and 225 from Madras, while in 1846, owing to a frightful famine in Madeira, the Portuguese immigration reached its maximum, nearly 6,000, arriving at once. And in the same year, the quota of East Indians from Calcutta leapt up to 1,373, and from Madras to 2,455.
China. Meanwhile, in China, the Opium Wars were being waged. 1839 to 1842, the First Opium War between China and Britain. By the end of the 18th century, the British East India Company had expanded the cultivation of opium in Bengal, selling it to private merchants who transported it to China. British and American merchants sent opium to warehouses in the free trade port of Canton and sold it to Chinese smugglers. Successive Chinese emperors issued edicts making opium illegal in 1729, 1799, 1814, and 1831, but imports grew as smugglers and colluding officials in China sought profit. By 1833, the Chinese opium trade soared to 30,000 chests. In 1839, following an edict from the emperor, Chinese troops enforced a shutdown and blockade of the factories where opium was stored. There was a small skirmish between British and Chinese warships in 1839 and a more protracted battle in 1840. The war was concluded by the Treaty of Nanking, or Nanjing, in 1842. The treaty ceded the Hong Kong Island and surrounding smaller islands to Britain and established 5 cities as treaty ports open to Western traders: Shanghai, Canton, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, or Amoy. The treaty also stipulated that China would pay a $21 million payment to Britain as reparations for the destroyed opium.
晚风吹送天河的星啊，归如绽放山映辉。
1856 to 1860, the Second Opium War was waged by Britain and France against China. In October 1856, a Chinese official seized the Arrow, a ship claiming British registration, and threw its crew into chains. The governor of British Hong Kong summoned a British fleet, which, on the 23rd of October, bombarded and captured the Pearl River forts on the approach to Canton and proceeded to bombard Canton. On the 15th of December, during a riot in Canton, European commercial properties were set on fire, and the British governor of Hong Kong appealed for military intervention. The execution of a French missionary drew military support from France. Britain and France now sought greater concessions from China, including the legalization of the opium trade, expanding of the transportation of laborers to European colonies, opening all of China to British and French citizens, and exempting foreign imports from internal transit duties. The war resulted in the 1858 Treaty of Tientsin, or Tianjin, in which the Chinese government agreed to pay war reparations for the expenses of the recent conflict, open a second group of 10 ports to European commerce, legalize the opium trade, and grant foreign traders and missionaries rights to travel within China. In addition, as Clementi records, 12 out of the 18 provinces of the Chinese Empire were devastated by rebellions, which lasted almost continuously from 1850 to 1873. In 1853, for example, northern China was convulsed by the Taiping Rebellion.
British Guiana. Meanwhile, back in British Guiana, in 1851, the Immigration Committee of the Court of Policy in the colony expressed the opinion, quote, that every possible means should be adopted to encourage emigration from China, end quote. They recommended that a vessel should be sent out to China immediately to embark immigrants, that wages not exceeding $4 a month should be guaranteed, and that an advance not exceeding $10 to be repaid by installments in British Guiana should be made to each immigrant before embarkation. These recommendations were adopted by the Court of Policy on the 25th of August, 1851, upon the motion of Mr. Peter Rose, seconded by Mr. George Booker, and the latter informed the government of British Guiana on the 2nd of September 1851 that he was willing to dispatch from Georgetown to China a vessel, the Lord Elgin, 351 tons, quote, for the purpose of making a commencement at as early a period as possible of importing laborers from that part of the world, end quote, upon condition that the vessel should convey to Madras on her way out a shipload of returning East Indians. Governor Berkeley accepted this offer, and the Lord Elgin sailed from Georgetown on the 6th of October 1851 with 146 East Indians on board. Thus commenced the voyage, which 15 months later Governor Berkeley described as, quote, a most disastrous one to all concerned, end quote. In view of this venture, Governor Berkeley issued a proclamation, dated the 21st of April, 1852, fixing at $100 the bounty to be paid on immigrants introduced into the colony, quote, from China or from any part east of Point de Galle in Ceylon, end quote. Funds for payment of the bounty had already been provided. On the 14th of October 1851, upon the motion of Mr. P. Rose, seconded by Mr. G. Quayle, the Court of Policy had resolved that the sum of £50,000, a part of the parliamentary loan of £250,000, should be applied to the introduction of Chinese immigrants. Mr. White, the government immigration agent, reached Hong Kong on the 10th of October 1852, only to find that the first two immigrant ships had already left China for British Guiana. The third was about to leave in the following month. Messrs. Hyde, Hodge, and Company also dispatched a ship to bring laborers from China. Their ship, the Glen Tanner, 615 tons, left Amoy on the 1st of September 1852, having on board 305 Chinese. She touched at Batavia and Algoa Bay, and after a voyage of 131 days, reached Georgetown on the 12th of January 1853. During the voyage, 43 Chinese died, and immediately on arrival of the ship, 12 immigrants, the half of whom died, were sent to hospital, while 2 more died on board, and 4 others went to hospital a few days later, a total mortality of 16.7%. Dr. E. A. Manged, the acting health officer in Georgetown, reported that the mortality on board the Glen Tanner would have been greater, but for the comparatively quick passage made by the vessel, 4 to 6 days less than the Lord Elgin, that the chief cause of it was undoubtedly the length of the voyage and the fact that the Glen Tanner was unsuitable as an immigrant ship, being badly ventilated and having too little room on deck for the number she carried.
草原夜似美，秋天明月总相随。
Messer Booker and brother's ship, the Lord Elgin, had on the 23rd of July, 1852, embarked at Amoy 154 Chinese immigrants, of whom 115 were men and 39 were boys under 21 years of age. The voyage to Singapore occupied 62 days, during which time 4 Chinese died. The voyage from Singapore to Anjar, a port in the Straits of Sunda on the Java shores, occupied 23 days, during which time 5 Chinese died. On the 24th of October, 3 days after leaving Anjar, it was discovered that the vessel had sprung a leak and made considerable water. Thereupon, the ship was observed to be steaming considerably, owing to the fermentation of rice below the passenger's deck. The fermentation filled the vessel with sulfurated hydrogen gas to such an extent that everything painted became discolored and black. The deadly exhalations from this fermenting rice resulted in increased sickness among the emigrants. So much so that in the 46 days of the voyage from Anjar to the Cape of Good Hope, there were 41 deaths. During the 39 days passage from the Cape to Demerara, there were 19 deaths, making altogether 69 deaths among 154 Chinese immigrants shipped at Amoy, a mortality of 44.8. The vessel arrived at Demerara on the 17th of January, 1853, after a voyage of 177 days. Governor Barclay appointed a special commission consisting of Mr. Vandergunetscher, member of the Court of Policy, Dr. D. Blair, Surgeon General, and Mr. R. G. Butts, Inspector General of Police, to inquire into the causes of the terrible mortality. And this commission reported that the causes were A. The very long confinement in foul air. B. The crankness of the vessel, the want of room for exercise, and the deficient supply of variety in food, especially fresh provisions. C. The failure to observe the rules and regulations of the Passengers Act of 1852, which, if adopted, would, in the opinion of the Commission, have prevented most, if not all, of the calamities of the voyage. Both the captain and the surgeon in charge of the Lord Elgin were ill during the voyage. The ship owners, even after receiving the bounty on the immigrants landed alive, sustained a loss. Thus concluded Clementi, I think no one can fail to agree with Governor Barclay's opinion as the disastrous nature of this venture. Between the 12th of January and 4th of March 1853, there had landed in Georgetown 647 male emigrants, namely 262 from Glen Tanner, 85 from the Lord Elgin, and 300 from the Samuel Boddington. No Chinese women had so far arrived in British Guiana. The first female Chinese immigrants would not arrive until the 11th of March 1860 on the Whirlwind. All Chinese immigrants who arrived in the Lord Elgin were allotted to the Blankenberg estate. Those who arrived in the Glentanner were distributed between plantations La Jalousie, Windsor Forest, and Klin Poitrin, while those who arrived in the Samuel Boddington were assigned to plantations Anna Katrina, Schoonard, Vredenhoop, Haarlem, Stewartsville, and Hague. The Glentanner brought only one man who, by residing at Sydney, had acquired a limited knowledge of English, and one other who had picked up a few words of French in Mauritius. On board the Lord Elgin, there was not a single Chinese acquainted with any language other than his native one. The only interpreter in the Samuel Boddington was a boy speaking but a few words of English. In all, therefore, 3 indifferent interpreters amongst 647 Chinese laborers distributed over 10 estates.
晚风轻拂绿色的梦啊，悠扬如雨落边吹
Hoa Hing. Ho Hin, better known locally as Andrew Hunter Hoa Hing, was born at Sam Shui in the province of Kwangtung in or about the year 1843. Ahing is a corruption of Ah Hin. When a boy of 19, Hoa Hing was induced to immigrate in search of a fortune and sailed from China in the Red Riding Hood, reaching Georgetown on the 11th of April, 1862. He was assigned to Plantation Eliza and Mary, East Coast, Berbice, where he began his term of indenture. Later, he was transferred to Plantation Bath on the same coast. The manager there, Mr. Andrew Hunter, recognizing his ability, made him a driver. Having accumulated some money, Hoa Hing opened a shop on the estate. The venture prospered, and soon afterwards he started a second business. At last, in 1882, when he had been 20 years in the colony, Hoa Hing found himself in a position to commence business in the town of New Amsterdam, where he rapidly became the leading merchant. In 1894, he purchased the sugar estate known as Plantation Smithfield. And in 1898, further extending his activities, he bought Lot 13, Water Street, Georgetown, where Messrs. Wheating and Richter's ice factory now stands. Here he started a large wholesale store, which he subsequently removed in 1908 to Lot 25, Lombard Street, where the business was carried on until the premises were destroyed by the fire of 22nd of December, 1913. He was only partly insured, and the loss was such a shock to him that he died soon afterwards at his residence, Lot 39, High Street, Georgetown, at the ripe age of 70. In 1880, he had married Miss Ruth Wan at Plantation Bath, and 12 children were born to him. One of them, Joseph, was educated at the Diocesan School in Hong Kong, at Ilminster Grammar School in England, and at Queen's College in Georgetown. Joseph went to England in 1910 to read for the bar, and was admitted a student of the Middle Temple, but died in January 1912 before sitting for his final examination. The second son, Benjamin Hunter, was born at New Amsterdam and was also educated at Hong Kong and Ilminster. He has been manager of the business in Georgetown since 1900 and is a well-traveled man, having been round the world twice. A daughter, Martha, born in 1890 at New Amsterdam, was educated at the convent in that town, but leaving in 1911 she entered the Grosvenor College in England and is now a student of medicine in Edinburgh. Editor's note: half a century later, in Marlene Coke Crawford's Biographical Sketches of Chinese in Guyana, there is only one reference to a Hoa Hing by marriage, and she has migrated. It seems that the family had left British Guiana by then. Several of Hoa Hing's children, including Benjamin, moved to the UK. At least two, Rachel Ruth and Isaac, settled in Singapore. There was even an accounting firm called Andrew Hunter Hoa Hing and Company operating in Singapore from 2004 to 2017. Isaac Hunter Hoa Hing also served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War.
晚风轻拂绿色的梦啊，牛羊如云，罗边春。